Hey, everybody. Welcome to the City Council chambers, and thank you for coming to our open records and open meetings training. The lector today is going to be Annika Lockhart. She is an Assistant Attorney General at the Attorney General's office here in North Dakota. Her portfolio consists, I believe, almost exclusively the open records and open meetings. Yeah, the open meetings laws. So please help me in giving her a warm welcome and thanking her for coming up and speaking to us today.
Good morning. Thank you for that introduction, Steph. You covered my first slide for me. So I'll just kind of jump in. This is my disclaimer. I am with the Attorney General's office. I am an Assistant Attorney General, but I'm not your attorney. That's Steph and Nick. So I'm not giving any legal advice today. This is all just informational. I'm happy to take any questions. If I can answer your question by directing you to a statute or to an AG opinion, I'll do that. If you ask me something that I can't direct you to, don't hold me to my answers. I know this is being recorded. Don't send me a clip if you have a question. You're just going to get my expertise if we need to kind of get outside of that. But any specific questions that you have, definitely talk to your city attorneys. So I'll start, we have a couple goals this morning. I'll start by identifying definitions applicable to open record and meeting laws, talk about responding to open record requests. I'll be giving legislative updates, and we'll talk about posting notices for meetings, some updates on executive session too, and then I'll wrap up with kind of reviewing what the opinion process looks like in my office and what some penalties can be for violations. So starting at the very beginning, most of what I'm talking about today, the basis is definitely the North Dakota Constitution, Article 11. From there, we have North Dakota Century Code, Chapter 4404. That's the open record, open meeting laws. If I'm talking about that, it's probably going to be in Chapter 4404. And I might refer to some secondary sources like AG opinions, or there's one Supreme Court case in here too. Attorney General opinions have the effect of law until the Supreme Court says that they don't. So open records, what's covered by open records? That's going to be all records in your possession that are regarding public business. So all of us, we probably have computers full of open records. Most of our emails are going to be open. This recording will be open. Meeting minutes, most agenda items, those types of things. Got a little ahead of myself. Here's the statutory definition on what a record is. That's set by statute, but again, those examples are going to be our emails, our notes. If you're taking notes today, those could be open records. Any type of preliminary draft, working papers for a contract, those types of things, all of that's going to be open records. Public business, here's the statute again. We probably don't need to get into a whole lot. Your city employees, most of what you're doing is going to be public business. In North Dakota, most of our records are open. What you're going to be looking for is a law that says it's not open. That can say a couple different things. I might say not subject to Article 11 of the North Dakota Constitution. That's some of your police reports. Those exemptions say not subject to. Some laws still say not an open record. Most likely you're going to see the words exempt or confidential. So for exempt, those records may be released. The city has discretion. The commission might need to take action. It could still be called a closed record. That's going to be something that the commission or your department, it's an exempt record, but you have a policy saying we never release this. That would be considered a closed record. Never against the law to release an exempt record. Always up to you, the commission, department heads. Confidential usually can't be released, usually have no discretion. Sometimes the statute will say confidential except to these people or until this point. And if it is confidential, this does have the Class C felony penalty. Here's a couple examples of what's exempt. Most of our employee information in our personnel files, month, date of birth, home address, cell phone number, photograph, emergency contact information, bank account information, most things in your employee personnel file, that's going to be exempt. Internal investigations, those are exempt as well. And then confidential, social security numbers, always confidential. I'm not sure how anybody knows your computer password, but for some reason, this is in the statute that computer passwords are confidential. Any use of employee assistance programs, and if you're with a department or the police department, if you have the background checks from BCI, you go through a bunch of training for those, you know those are highly confidential, but it's specified in the statute too. So some examples of records that are generally open, again, that personnel file, not only does it include the list of information that I talked about, but it's also job performance, any evaluations, annual reviews. If you put things like emails saying doing a good job in your personnel file, that's all going to be open. All of our business-related emails, and it doesn't matter what device the record is on. So if you have Outlook or Teams on your phone and you get an open record request and you're screenshotting those Teams messages or emails, you can do that. It doesn't matter if it's on your cell phone, your home computer, your VPN in, whatever that is, the protection or not applies to the record, not the device. I think we're getting more comfortable with that, but I leave that reminder in here. And then your city contracts. Most of those at some point become open. That includes prices and costs. So we did examples of records that are open. Here's some examples of exempt records. This first one was a change last legislative session, 2021, that kind of expanded medical record exemptions. Of course, HIPAA and all your other laws apply, but for open record purposes, any medical record, the entire medical record, or some other record that has medical information, that can be exempt now. You don't have to go through and just go through the HIPAA analysis. You can say, this is a personnel file, they had to take some leave because they had a medical issue, they emailed it explaining it to their boss, that whole email can be protected. You don't have to go through and figure out if they're a HIPAA covered entity or anything like that. Your job applications. This was another 2021 legislative change. Applications, any materials in an application file that identifies the applicant are now exempt. Those used to be confidential, and then we ran into the very practical problem of how do you follow up on references if the whole file is confidential. So we didn't want any public employees committing felonies. We made it exempt. Follow up on references as you want. Finalist information, that remains open. When you or the city commission or the department decides on finalists, applications are open. Once you get the job, files open. Active litigation records. If you're in active litigation, there's a little bit more protection of what's exempt. If somebody sues the city on issue A, your attorneys do a bunch of research, and somebody sues you on the same issue, that protection can go, is now exempt. So it expanded that a little bit, but as far as I know, it's not used that much. So this is talking about contracts. If you're working with vendors, there's different kind of levels of protection for records throughout the process. Trade secret, proprietary, commercial, and financial information is confidential as long as it's of a privileged nature. So if you do a lot of contracts and you're getting responses to bids, it's pretty common for vendors to attach a bunch of things. And then you get an open record request and you tell the vendor, we have a record request, we're gonna share this. Suddenly, everything that they attached is confidential. No, it's not. It's your business address. Like, we can go through, we can redact the software things that might be proprietary, but you need to do the analysis on if it's privileged. And a lot of vendors, especially with government, they're with other cities or with other states. This is already released by Fargo. You're not going to be able to use this to protect it. And that can take some back and forth if you're working with the vendors. Any economic development records information, that's always exempt. Any bids that you receive, those are exempt until the bids have been received and opened by City Commission. Proposals that you receive in response to requests are exempt until City Commission or the office issues that notice of intent to award. Once City Commission opens it or once the notice of award is issued, again, it's all open. That's usually when you're going to get the record request because you've told one vendor you didn't get it. Well, now they want everybody else's packet. And then suddenly it's all confidential. Yeah, there's a question. Okay, so the question there is if there's a process in North Dakota law for the entity to contact a vendor to let them know that there's been an open record request? Okay, not by statute, at least not for open records. I think it's a best practices. A lot of people do that. It is a good time for them to tell you, yes, the software information that you gave you is proprietary, because sometimes you don't know. So I think it's best practices, but nothing in 4404 that requires you to do that. And then that last bullet point is just saying the records that name and describe the company that's open. So we have our first legislative change from this year. This is just the law enforcement records. So descriptions of crime scene images that include minors are exempt. So we've had protections for crime scene images of minors. Any crime scene that has a minor victim, that image has been exempt. And then we ran into the problem, not a problem, but we ran into the scenario with officers or like BCI is reviewing certain crimes with minors and they're dictating and they're putting it in the report. This is what the video shows. And sometimes that can be really graphic and there was no protection. So now we're just kind of carrying through that protection of the image of the minor to the description of the image. So that's going to be exempt as of next Tuesday. Okay. I'm going to move on to responding to record requests. How many people have gotten record requests or like work with records? Okay, quite a few of you. Does somebody want to give me an example of like a frequent record request that you get? Personnel file. Okay. Okay. So you're all probably aware everybody gets to ask for a record. They can ask for the record. They can ask to come in and look at it. There's nothing in law that says you have to be a citizen, that you have to live in Minot. I do these trainings and I find out there's like international people that ask for some things. So I always learn something new too. If they ask, they get to see it. Generally, you can't make them fill out a form. You can certainly ask for written clarification, like a follow-up email. If somebody walks in or calls and you're just not sure what exactly you're looking for, you can say, send me an email. The one thing that you can verify if you have a confidential or exempt record, sometimes with personnel files, like if there's a lawsuit, then there might be an attorney that can access them, or traffic records, attorneys, insurance companies have access to. Then you can say, who are you? Do you represent anyone? But otherwise, identity doesn't matter. And that next bullet point is just kind of saying the same thing. By North Dakota law, you only have to provide one copy of the record once. So if somebody emails you today, asks for a personnel file, you get it to them, and tomorrow they email you, my computer crashed, I want another copy. Okay, you can provide it if you want, but you don't have to. You always have to provide the records that are requested, but if the request comes in and it's a personnel file, and I want John Smith's personnel file, and I want you to tell me why he doesn't work for the city anymore, you can ignore the second part. You don't have to respond to opinions or explanations. Just provide the personnel file. Here you go. If they're just saying, I want to know why John Smith doesn't work there anymore, that's not a request for records. Don't need to respond at all. The record does need to reasonably and clearly identify the record. Again, if you're not sure what they're asking for, if you have two John Smiths that work here and you need to know, you can ask some follow-up questions. You only have to provide records that you have in your possession. I still get this question fairly often. I think my reminder here right now is maybe not so much for the city, but if you have a record that you know that you definitely don't have, or one department doesn't have, and like the police department doesn't have it, you know the auditor should have it. Your response can just be, we have no records responsive, but the auditor's gonna have those records, go contact the auditor. I would caution you forwarding the request and then you becoming the requester, possibly. And then it kind of turns into who's the requester, when was it asked for, who passes it on. It can just get kind of complicated. So if you have the records, always provide them. If you don't have the records, my suggestion is say you don't have them. You can certainly refer them, but don't get in the position of you then emailing the auditor saying, oh, we need these records. The one thing that you also can't do, this is specific to statute, you can't have a contract with a third party. We're starting to see this a little bit more with kind of off-site data storage companies where like your emails get backed up after so many years. If you get a request and it is stored with a third-party company, if it's stored, you still need to get it and provide the record. You can't just say, oh, it's with this third-party IT company, we can't get it. Nope, as long as you have it, you have access to it, still need to respond. Following that, you don't have to create any new records or put them in a new format. If you get requests for like travel expenses of the city commissioners for the last 10 years and they want it in an itemized spreadsheet, you probably need to go find the financial records for the last 10 years. But if they're in a filing cabinet or just in a PDF file of receipts, that's what you can provide. You don't need to go through and itemize them in a spreadsheet just because they were asked. The one thing you do have to do, though, if they ask for a paper copy and you only have electronic copies, as I think most of us do now, you do have to provide that paper copy, and you can charge. We'll talk about the charging slide here in a minute. Another thing you don't have to do, we talked about, I said like screenshotting on your phone, like your Teams messages. Maybe you have text messages that would meet the definition of a record. If those are requested, you, for open record purposes, don't have to provide access to your cell phone. You can screenshot it, email it, whatever you need to do to get it to the person that's going to respond. But for open record purposes, you're not going to have to hand in your phone and let somebody go through it. You have to provide a legal reason if you're going to deny any records. Records are open unless there's a law that says they're not. So if you're not providing the records, there's a law, you need to provide what that law is to the requester. You also need to tell the requester if the record doesn't exist. They ask for a personnel file for John A. Smith. John A. Smith never worked for the city. Respond right away saying, we have no such record. You can't just ignore that request. You should always review and redact for confidential or exempt information. And communicate with the requester if you know there's going to be a delay or somebody's out of the office on vacation or It's going to take time to go find their records, just kind of a quick response. We've received your request. We're working on it. We anticipate a bit of a delay. That can go a long way in keeping them from calling my office. If records are available on your website, you can certainly refer them to the website. The big thing here, I think, meeting minutes, agendas, those getting posted on the website seem to make a difference. Efficiency on those requests. If somebody calls and says, I want the meeting minutes from last week's city commission meeting, great, they're on our website. If they ask for that paper copy, you need to provide that. If they tell you they don't have internet access, you need to get them a copy. Don't just tell them go to the library. They have internet there. You do need to respond to record requests within a reasonable time. And we probably all have slightly different definitions of what reasonable is. And at least Attorney General opinions take that into consideration. So we don't really have you must respond within 24 hours or you must respond within a week. We've looked at different factors. So here's a list of factors that we've used you can kind of keep in mind when you're responding. But it's all very fact dependent. So if you need to consult with your attorneys, if you're not sure whether the record is open, if you have to go through and remove a lot of confidential information, if it's a huge request or there's going to be a lot of documents returned, big email requests, old files that aren't digitized yet, how accessible the documents are, and then office staff availability. I think kind of any city, county around election time, a bunch of record requests, it's going to take a little bit more time to get back to those than it maybe would in January. And we've looked at those different factors. Again, just trying to communicate that to the requester can go a long way. Here's the charging slide that I talked about. If most of you work with records, you're probably well aware of this, but here's the reminder. You can charge up to 25 cents a page. You can charge actual cost of postage, large maps, color photos. Your first hour to locate records is always free, then it's $25 an hour. Same goes for redacting confidential information. You can always require payment for these things before doing any of the work. And then if you have 5 or more requests from the same requester within a week, you can treat that as one request for computing the time. So that's one requester, even if they're asking for 5 different things. Access is usually going to be free, but again, it kind of depends on where the records are, if they're confidential or not. You might already have something like this. This is the template that's posted on the AG's website that kind of includes the things that you need to remember. If you're redacting anything, there's kind of the checkbox to cite the law, and then about 3/4 of the way down is kind of that box to compute any charges if you want to charge for your records. Any records questions before I move on to meetings? Oh boy. I'm going to start with Michaela.
Okay. The one that I thought of is because last week we had a request that were files you don't have to create a I was listening. Okay. I'm required to, or am I allowed to say this is not?
Okay. So the question there is, in the past, maybe a former city clerk did create a record or did create a file for a company and responded to that record request. They've come back a little while later and said, you've done this for us before, can you create this record again? And then the question is, do you have to respond to that or not? My take from open records is no, because it's still a brand new request. You still don't have to create a record, but that's where it comes into. It kind of depends on the company and how happy you want to make them and what they do for you, and that's kind of the policy consideration that you or your department gets to make. But from open records, nope, it's a new record request. You don't have to create new records. The usual rules apply. Yes. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think that first question was about text messages, and then if you have like an employee or a citizen texting city commissioners, if those are gonna be open records, yes. And so that's where you kind of go back to the definition of record. Does it involve the public business or not? Because of course, city commissioners can get text messages just like anybody else reminding us to pick up our package, and that's not gonna matter. But if it's about public business and somebody asks for all of the text messages from the commissioners regarding this issue, you're probably gonna have to respond to that. I'd work with your city attorneys to kind of, if you have specific questions on that. And then your second question was, oh, yes. Okay. Okay. So this question is then about the citizens kind of reaching out to commissioners and maybe even public employees with what are your thoughts and opinions on this, and if you kind of have a stock response. From open records, I'm certainly fine with the stock response. I do still advise a couple occupational professional licensing boards, and I certainly encourage them to have those. Thank you for your interest in this. We've received your request. We'll review it, forward it on to whoever needs it. You know, those types of communications. Yeah, I don't think there's a problem with those at all. They'll probably be open records if anybody asks for it. But it is nice to have those, and you can kind of respond quickly. Yes. Okay. I'm not nodding yes to that. So this question is about social media, Facebook. I'm assuming it's going to be like if the city or the city commission has a Facebook page and people can interact and leave comments or posts, if that's going to be open or not. Okay. And Messenger probably gets a little bit more complicated then. So I'm gonna say like social media is kind of an open record, constitutional First Amendment kind of quagmire that I don't do a presentation on. Because we leave it, it's so fact specific too, that we usually leave that to the city attorneys to kind of do that First Amendment analysis. But that's usually the page because you for all of the constitutional reasons. Messenger, though, like if you kind of have a direct interaction with someone, I guess it's an interesting question. We haven't like formally taken a position on it, but I don't really see it too differently than a text message, would be my take. If it regards public business, it's a record, or if you're using Messenger during work hours on work Wi-Fi, like those types of analysis. Okay. Yeah, that seems consistent to me. If somebody's asking what time is the city commission meeting tonight and it's easier to respond on Messenger, that'd be similar to the public emailing you. Yeah, that makes sense to me too. Yes. Okay. I've heard of this. So this question is about, let me ask a follow-up first. What's this form? Is that the form to challenge a book or the form to be, okay, so the library has a form to challenge books that are in the library and you get record requests for those forms. I'm going to speak very generally and definitely defer to these two in the front, but it sounds like it's going to meet the definition of a record. Off the top of my head, I don't think of a lot of redaction, except that we do have the statute about the public communicating with a public entity, and you can redact like email address. So there might be a little bit of that, but for the most part, I would assume most of the form is open. The form I've never seen that I'm not sure what information it asks for. That's my disclaimer. But most of the information is probably open. If you run into issues with people being upset about you giving it, you could certainly just like kind of back down what questions you ask. That's what I tell my boards too. But generally, probably going to be an open record. Yes. Yes. Okay. So I think kind of a two-part question again. The first one is definition of a record. I did cover that right at the beginning on one or two slides. The statutes are there. You guys can have access to my slides if you want them. Just referencing 4404. Generally, your public employees, what you're doing day to day, probably going to be an open record. Okay. Sure. On a committee. Okay, so that's kind of a different analysis, but again, if it's public business and their emails, that's kind of a good example, probably gonna be subject to open records. Record retention policy, I don't cover that kind of in my general presentation because everybody gets to set it themselves. Like you get to tell the state what your record retention schedule is. And so you should check with, there should be somebody in city government who knows what the record retention schedule is. And especially for something specific like a committee, somebody should be able to tell you what that is. But it's set by you, so it varies widely. Yeah, record retention on the state, county, city level is much different than the feds. Yeah. Is there still a couple questions on this side? Yes. Okay. Okay, so this question is about format of requests. I agree with you. If somebody asks and you can generally understand what they're asking for and they have the right to access it, just give it to them. But I'm the open meeting person. Don't put a whole lot of barriers in front of access to the information. Unless there's something specific or your department has some type of policy or the city has a policy, if they ask, you understand what it is, it gets provided. That's my take. Oh, uh-oh.
So for city employees, we do have next requests. I know our police department use it often, fire department uses it often, I do too. My kind of form of judgment is if it's a quick and easy thing that we can kind of give to the person, let's do that. We don't have to put it in next request. If it's kind of more of a controversial issue, larger request, something we think somebody else might want down the road, I suggest we put it in next request. It tracks everything for us. You can easily print it out for the AG's office and say, I responded to them this time, and this time. They never got back to me, you know, that kind of thing. So it's a better record and protection for us to have it in next request. But yes, if it's a quick something simple that you can do, great. You can hand it over. If it's a quick email saying, can you please send me this document? Send it, you have it in your email, we can archive it for the AG's office if we need to also. If you ever have any questions on whether it should or should not go in next request, it probably should go, but you can always call myself, Steph, Nick, we're always willing to help. And then if you have any, PD, I can't ask a lot of, or answer a lot of your questions. You guys have way more exemptions and stuff than I do, and probably more rules as to what goes in there or not, but for all of our other employees, if you have questions on what goes in there or what shouldn't, just let me know.
I'll defer to Michaela. Yes. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yes. So this question is about bids and kind of when they need to be open, or when they can be provided. I did have my slide on that, and I hope I'm citing it correctly, but if I'm not, defer to the slide. So bids, those are open after they've been presented to city council. I appreciate the nods. Up until then, they're exempt. And so sometimes it can kind of be a discussion with the rest of your department or city attorneys. Sometimes you're like, okay, yeah, we really don't care. We can provide this, and it's exempt, so you can do that. Sometimes it might be really contentious, and you definitely don't want that out until city council opens it. Then you wait. But it's exempt, so it's up to somebody in the city. Yeah. Michaela? Oh. Okay. So this question is about airport security cameras and whether it's exempt or not. And it sounds like there's a federal statute that protects it. Okay, so under North Dakota state law in 4404, we do have protection for security system plans, cybersecurity, information that affects the safety of public buildings. That exemption could be protected under that. But then the beginning of all of the record statutes are except as otherwise provided by law. It's open, and so if it wouldn't fit under that state exemption, we do consider federal statute to be one of those other laws that you can protect. I guess it's exempt, and that makes sense. Yes. Okay. Okay. Okay, so this question is about, I think, even generally, like if anybody's taking notes, but here specifically, like, oh, the constituent coming up to you in the grocery store, sharing their opinions on a contentious issue or not a contentious issue, and you keep notes kind of to remember what's going on. Yes, notes are open records, as long as it meets the definition, the rest of the definition for public business. The one thing that I kind of say about notes is somebody has to know that you have them too, to make that specific request. But if they did, you would likely have to provide them, and keep that in mind kind of when you're taking notes. But depending on what's in them, like if there's some medical information, there might be some exemptions you could use. But generally, yeah, notes are going to be open records. Right. Yeah, if it's some type of request that's like any document, communication about agenda item number 7 from the last city commission meeting, and somebody came up to you at the grocery store with their thoughts on agenda item number 7, and you took notes, and you have enough in your notes that you know that's what it relates to, then yeah, I would say the notes are likely going to be open, minus whatever redactions you could do if, depending on what's in your notes. Yeah. Any other record questions? Yes. Okay, so this question is about text messages. Somebody else is asking you about a meeting, like, can you come to the meeting tonight? And you respond yes, and then you delete the message. Are you okay to delete it? It depends on your record retention schedule. Don't have one. There you go. I'm not answering any questions about record retention. And my take from open meetings, like outside of the record retention schedule that you don't have, would just be that you provide the records that you have. So if you don't have the record, you can't provide it. And I'll leave it at that. Yeah, OMB. Okay. Yeah. Uh-oh. Without a record retention schedule, you get to make those decisions. I'll leave it at that. Okay, moving on to open meetings. If you have questions as we go along, feel free to ask, but I'll move on to open meetings. Again, just kind of starting with the basics here. What's a meeting? Your city employees or on the commission, you probably have a general idea of what meetings are. But anytime there's a quorum of your governing body discussing public business, that's going to be a meeting. Jumping ahead a little bit, but that text message was a good reminder. Meetings can happen anywhere, including via text message. So if you have kind of a group, if you have a group text chain and you're talking about public business, I'd be careful doing that. But you certainly can do kind of the ministerial, can you make it to the meeting tonight? Those things would be okay in a text message. And I'll kind of break that down as we go along. But anywhere you have a quorum, that's going to be a meeting. And this is a reminder, I think this happens more kind of on city and county level. Anybody can attend the meetings. The public always has the right to access your meetings. That does not include the right to speak, though. That's up to kind of city commission policy or the chair of the commission. The same with identifying themselves. If somebody comes up, you might have a policy that you ask them to give their name, but if they don't want to, there's nothing in open meeting law that kind of pushes them to do that. And going back, what's a quorum going to be? Generally, it's going to be 1/2 or more of the members of the governing body, or a smaller number. If that's enough for the body to transact any business, that's going to be your committees. And this is my reminder slide about where meetings can happen: conference calls, short notice, teams, restaurants, the hallway outside of the commission chambers. Anytime you have a quorum, that's going to be a meeting. Should be properly noticed. There's certainly exceptions. Any type of chance social gathering, you're at a sporting event, the whole commission's there, that's fine. Don't talk about public business. Emergency operations, if you're involved in one of those, there's an exemption for that. Any attendance at national, regional, state associations, training for city commissioners, that's going to be an exception. Again, if you're at a training seminar, but you are discussing public business, then you might want to put a notice up. So committees, like I said, the definition of meetings includes committees. A committee is going to be 2 or more people that are acting collectively pursuant to any authority delegated by the commission. And that includes delegation of any public business. Even if the commission just says, okay, we want 2 commissioners to go research agenda item number 7 and report back, that can be a committee. Even if it wasn't delegated, they have no decision-making authority, they're just getting information. If it was delegated by city commission, you have 2 or more people doing it, that's a committee, needs to follow the open meeting notice requirements. 2 key questions if you're working with committees. Did city commission delegate any authority, or is the committee doing something that commission can do itself, like information gathering? And another reminder slide, again, if the committee doesn't have any final authority, if they're just information gathering, if the intention is only to recommend something to the commission, if the subject that the committee is working on is somehow within city commission authority that was delegated to the committee, quorum of your committee, it's a meeting, needs to be noticed. So there's 2 kinds of meetings. I'm assuming most of you are pretty familiar with this too, but this is going to be your regular meetings. Those are set by filing a yearly schedule. You still have to create an agenda for every meeting. You need to discuss, for regular meetings, you can discuss items not on the agenda. You can amend the agenda as you need to throughout the meeting. The agenda does need to include the topics known at the time the agenda is being drafted, but you can have some general terms: old business, new business, reports from the committees. Special meeting, that's our second type of meeting. That's when you're limited to discussing the items on the published agenda, when the agenda is published. That could be updated right before the meeting. You could leave the meeting, update the agenda, come back in. But at some point, you're going into a special meeting with a published agenda. You're limited to the topics on that agenda. And for those reasons, the agenda needs to be specific. You can't have that old business. People need to know what you're talking about at a special meeting with some specificity. So notice requirements. The notice must include the time, date, location of the meeting, topics you anticipate discussing, notice of any executive sessions, and if the meeting is held electronically, the information for the public to be able to join that needs to be provided in the notice. That could be just a hyperlink, click on it, or the full URL. However that works, somehow the public needs to be able to get into that electronic meeting though. With notices, generally the public just needs to be able to read it and know what city commission is talking about and how to get there. And the notice needs to be provided when the city commission knows. So if an email goes to them with, here's the agenda, that's when the agenda needs to be posted on the website or outside the meeting room, wherever that goes, pretty quickly. When city commission knows what's going on, the public should know what's going on. Sometimes you can have a special meeting when the members might know the date, but you don't have an agenda. So this is where city commission is talking about an agenda item and they know, okay, we're not going to get through this tonight. We need to look into this some more. Let's set a special meeting. And they have that discussion during the commission meeting. Who's available Friday at 9:00? That's a great time. We're going to notice that as a special meeting, but we're not entirely sure what all is going to be on that agenda. That's fine. Just get the notice up and you can update the agenda later. And then the notice needs to go in a couple places. It needs to be posted at the main office, presumably someplace in City Hall that you do that. And then location of the meeting on the day of the meeting, usually right outside the meeting room. And then, oh good, I did update this. It needs to go to the city auditor, the city auditor's designee. And now this will be a change as of next Tuesday. If you have you have a website. The notice must be posted on the website. That used to be an or. It could go to the city auditor or on your website, and now it has to go in both places. Anybody who requests it should always get notice. And then for special meetings, notice needs to be sent to your official newspaper. And that's just sending one direction. It doesn't have to be for general commission meetings. It doesn't have to be published in the newspaper. That's up to the newspaper to decide what they want to do. But you need to notify them of the special meeting. Yes, question. Okay. Okay, so this question is specific to the library board, but if questions come in, the public's just asking, what is the library board going to talk about at the next meeting, and there's no agenda set. My take on that would be that it's a request for information, and no, you don't have to respond. If they're like, I want the agenda for the next meeting, that's a record request. You do provide the agenda, if you have one. If you don't have it yet, you say, we don't have it yet. And that can be the end of it. You don't even have to follow up and provide it later. That's my take from the open meeting law requirements. Yes, the library director might be saying something different. Mm-hmm. Okay. I've been getting a lot of these questions in the last 2 days. So this question is about what website does it go on? I'm not sure yet. I think you can kind of work with your city attorneys or director, kind of department heads. Right now, the law says it has to go on the public entity's website. So I'm kind of going with whatever makes sense. If the governing entity has a website, it goes on the governing entity's website. I know there's going to be like sub things. Those are going to be a little harder to figure out. I have no intention of just having a ton of violations next month. I really hope I don't get all those opinion requests. But my take is to just kind of use some common sense with it. The legislature didn't really give us any more guidance on that. It was just trying to kind of clean up where they need to go so the public knows. If it's someplace that makes sense for the public to find it, I think you're going to be in substantial compliance. Please don't send me this clip next month. Mm-hmm.
I will also say, because of the does start putting their agenda. Sign themselves up for notify me. So there is that possibility.
Yeah, that's a really good reminder. Thanks, Michaela. I know the state does that through the Secretary of State's website, but I wasn't aware that cities are doing that too, so thanks. I already covered that piece. Okay, then moving into meeting minutes. By statute, meeting minutes have some statutory requirements. So minutes have to contain name of the members attending the meeting, date and time the meeting was called to order and adjourned. I underlined that because we kind of get trends in open meetings, and one of the recent trends is people just not putting when they were called to order and adjourned. They just cut off, and technically that's a violation. There might be forthcoming opinions on that. And so just make sure you're kind of meeting all these statutory things. So the reminder that time called to order and adjourned need to be in there. List of the topics discussed, I think that's the easiest one for minutes. You also have to include a description of each motion made, whether it was seconded and by whom. And then results of every vote that was taken and vote of each member on every roll call vote. Roll call votes are required for all non-procedural votes. And I take a pretty broad interpretation on non-procedural, not just me, I suppose. AG opinion precedent says that we do that too. And it just includes all votes that pertain to the merits of the matter before the body. So I think most of your votes are going to be recorded roll call votes, but some of that just depends on how the commission, kind of what their past precedent is and what the city attorney advises. So common meeting violations. I think we've talked a little bit around this, but most of the time it's going to be emails, other communication methods like text messages, where you have a quorum that's involved discussing public business. What is permissible is providing information to the members to review before the meeting. Somebody probably sends out the agenda and notice to city commission saying, here's all the attachments for discussion at next week's meeting. That's going to be a quorum, but of course that's permissible. You're just passing information one way. If you do need some response, like for setting a special meeting, when is a good time to set this special meeting? Is it going to be Tuesday, Thursday? You can get that response from the quorum. That type of ministerial practice is going to be okay, but be careful because you can definitely run into something that's impermissible pretty quickly. If everybody's just CC'd, BCC can be a good way to kind of avoid this, but you can certainly have somebody reply all to that agenda saying, these are my thoughts and feelings on this, and now you might have an open meeting violation because you've had a commissioner talk about public business to a quorum, even though it's via email or text message. Yeah. So the question is, does this have to deal with nonprofits? Can I get off with it depends? It will depend on that public entity analysis. And I think I left that slide completely off this presentation because you're city employees, you know that you're part of a public entity. But nonprofits are a good question. That gets into Attorney General opinion analysis on when they're a public entity and when they're not. So some nonprofits could receive public funds, and then for the purposes of the public funds, there should be an open meeting. But that's a real fact-specific analysis. Michaela. Okay. Yeah, so Michaela's question here is one member individually reaching out to other members and talking about public business. Yeah, I think that's gonna be one or two slides ahead, but we would call that, no, that's okay. We would call that straw polling probably, and really anybody can do that and it can definitely be problematic, but I'll elaborate on that, and if not, just prompt me to come back to it. Yes. Okay, so this question, I think there's a question in there, is what if probably a commissioner is kind of presenting their opinion, or if they're saying, I intend to bring this issue up, I want you to be aware of it ahead of time, as a courtesy. My take on that is that I think there's a little bit of a distinction on what you're doing there. If it is sharing your opinion, that's going to get into possible open meeting violation. If it's, these are the facts of an agenda item, or kind of more like that ministerial, the staff could provide it. My suggestion is that it goes through staff so they can kind of present that like attached. That's kind of the easier way to handle that, but it's going to be real fact, like email by email, paragraph by paragraph specific. Yes. Yeah. Right. And that is where we have AG opinions that have talked about that, kind of the second bullet point there under violations, is just having a member sharing their thoughts, ideas, or opinions to a quorum, even if nobody's responding, can be a meeting violation. Yes, that goes both ways. Right. Yeah. Very generally. Yes, it can. And I also make that suggestion because like the city clerk or city attorney, they kind of see those things more often. And so they're kind of in a better spot to kind of weigh what really is ministerial, what is an opinion, what would be a violation. And my take is if it's getting into like real opinion, that needs to happen in an open meeting. Like that's the chance for the commission to hear about it and the public to hear about it. We can certainly argue more afterwards. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. It was the next slide. There we go. Yeah, and I think, thanks for that, Steph. That's kind of where you get into like the straw polling and the serial meetings, probably a little bit more straw polling. So this is when anybody, can be staff, can be another commissioner, is calling other commissioners prior to the meeting and polling what their votes could be. And so you kind of have one person as the receptacle, and that's going to be problematic. It's not specific in the statute, but it is interpreted by AG opinions. And that's kind of where this whole potential violation all rolls together. That you can definitely have things that start as permissible communications that somebody runs with, that somebody responds all to something that makes it impermissible, and that's where it's just very fact specific. That I think for employees, you just need to be careful when you're doing kind of that CC to everyone and what responses come in. And then for commissioners, on what you're sharing, and just kind of if you're in a situation where you're starting to get uncomfortable that this might be looking like a meeting violation, kind of running to whoever should be aware of that, probably starting with the city attorney's office or however the city kind of decided to handle that. And serial meetings, that can be smaller gatherings that collectively constitute a quorum discussing public business. We have numerous AG opinions on this issue too. So moving into executive sessions. Executive sessions can happen in any regular or special meeting. This is when part of the meeting is closed to the public. So that has to be specifically authorized by law. Without authorization to close the meeting, it's going to be open. Most common reason for executive session is discussing exempt or confidential records, consulting with your attorney, or providing some type of negotiation strategy to either your attorney or a negotiator. Most common violation is closing the meeting to discuss personnel matters. I still get this question a lot. Nobody wants to talk about personnel matters in an open meeting, but the law says you have to. The one thing that you can close the meeting to discuss with personnel is going to be if you're negotiating a contract or negotiation strategy for an exit or something like that. That can be discussed in executive session, but just having a general personnel issue, two people not getting along, that's not going to be enough reason for an executive session. If you need to fire someone. Yep. It depends. Right. Yes. Could be. Very fact dependent, but yes. Yes. Where your city attorney says it does. So we start with attorney consultation. There's two ways to go into executive session to consult with your attorneys. The first is to get their advice about reasonably predictable or pending litigation. And we need some type of, again, there's a lot of opinions that interpret this, but in my take is they certainly need to have the litigation filed, or they've come in and said, I'm suing you. After that, it can be, or these are two separate ways to receive the attorney's advice or guidance on legal risks, strengths, weaknesses of the action. If that discussion was held in public, would have an adverse fiscal effect. And that last piece in bold is the important piece, because of course, the city commission probably receives a lot of advice and guidance from city attorney on legal risks, strengths, weaknesses of different actions. And that always happens, not always, that frequently happens in an open meeting. But if you get to something where the advice would have an adverse fiscal effect, so the city commission needs to decide between option A or B, and it's going to be a lot of money or not a lot of money, I guess just adverse, that's when they can go into executive session. The reminder, I think you're probably pretty familiar with this one. Just because your city attorney is sitting in on the meeting doesn't make it automatically an attorney consultation. We had a Supreme Court case last year. It was Schmitz v. the State Board of Chiropractic Examiners. And as I talk about like these next 3 slides, I'll kind of leave this up here, but it has changed because we changed the law, but I left it in more to get to the next slide. So there was a licensed chiropractor who sued the State Board of Chiropractic Examiners over an executive session. He thought they were having impermissive discussions. And the district court agreed that some of it was, and it was appealed to the Supreme Court, and they released some of it, sent it back to district court, they released some more of it, it was appealed to the Supreme Court, they released some more of it, and at the end of this, there's about 18 minutes that should have happened in open session. And 8 of those minutes, the recording had just been left on. It was actually the open session. So there was different examples. I can, again, make these slides available if you want to go through them. But a lot of the discussion was kind of asking, board members asking the executive director, what was the history of this case before? Or kind of board members talking to each other about the case. And the Supreme Court very narrowly, 3-2, but the majority said they needed more kind of question and answer from the attorney. The attorney consultation needed to be consulting with the attorney. And then the legislature made a legislative change to that section. And so I think this is kind of an evolving area. If you're having attorney consultations, this is going to be the new statute as of next week, that all statements made by a participant or between participants during the session for the purposes of attorney consultation are exempt if it somehow relates to the subject, we put a lot of words in there, for which attorney consultation was established. So generally, if you go in to talk about a pending litigation and anybody is talking about the case, that should be protected. But this is evolving, so this is going to be a change as of next week, and we'll see where it goes. Executive session for negotiation strategy. The session must relate to a strategy or providing instructions to your attorney or negotiator. It also needs to regard a pending claim, litigation, adversarial administrative hearing, or some type of contract. And that needs to be currently negotiated or reasonably likely for negotiation to occur in the future. Sometimes you see these with contracted employees. Teachers are an example, like those are very set on these happen every year or whatever that term is. Those types of situations could fit in here. But again, it has to have that adverse fiscal effect. If the public was aware of this discussion, it would somehow hurt the city commission financially, then you can go into executive session. Because again, you probably talk about contracts all the time in open session that don't fit under this. Uh-oh. So this question is, could negotiation strategy be something city commission could discuss in executive session if it regards like a land purchase? Yeah. That's going to be very case by case. It certainly could, but then there's kind of the decision of should you talk about it in executive session or not. The commission can kind of make that decision with the city attorney's office. I know that we have at least one attorney general's opinion on this. I think it was Mandan or Morton County that deals with that issue. And it just depends. I think generally, yes, staff can look for land. I'm not sure where kind of the open meeting consideration would come in. Like it would have to come to the council. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sure. And the request and probably the proposals are too. Where negotiation strategy and executive session comes in, I think is a couple steps down the road from that. If staff comes in and says, we need more space and we need to expand, what location can we go to, or do you authorize us to go look for that? That's all probably generally open, but they find the land, There's some negotiation decisions on the prices or other bidders, those types of things. That's when an executive session may or may not be appropriate. Right. Then I think you still need to be negotiating with somebody, either the seller or other bidders, or because we're talking negotiation, right? If it's just, hey, there's a piece of land, we're interested in buying it, might not be negotiating anything. You're just going to pay the price that they give you. That wouldn't be appropriate for executive session. So that's where it's kind of dependent. Okay. The law has requirements for how to hold an executive session. You always need to start in the open meeting. I've been seeing this come up lately too. So just a reminder, even if it's a special meeting and the only agenda item is executive session, you still start in the open meeting. Take roll, say what time it starts, go through the rest of these steps, but you need to have the open meeting at least for a couple minutes. Because you need to do this announcement of the topics to be discussed, legal authority. Most of the time, this information is included in your notice and agenda. If the council is going to be talking about confidential information, nobody needs to make a motion. They just say, we're going to discuss this confidential information, kind of specify as much as you can what it's going to be, cite the legal authority to close it, ask the public to leave, you can carry on. If you're talking about exempt or closed information, then the council is going to have a motion. That's all happening in the open meeting. Then you ask the public to leave. You're required to record the session and keep it for 6 months. Note the time the executive session started, ended, and who attended in your minutes. And your discussion is limited to the topics in the announcement. So you might have a special, or I suppose regular meeting where you need to have multiple executive sessions. Then you need to be coming in and out to discuss those different topics. Usually whatever final action city council is going to make, that needs to happen in the open meeting. A couple slides here at the end on violation. Just like anybody can attend a meeting or make a record request, anybody can also request an attorney general's opinion to review written denials of requests for records or denial of access to a meeting. And that can mean improperly noticed, those types of things. That request needs to be made within 30 days of the alleged record violation or 90 days of alleged meeting violations. And what that process looks like, our website has an info box, or you can email our office, or you can send a letter. I think we're pretty fluid with that. If you make a request for an opinion in some way, we have to review it. For open record and open meetings, it gets reviewed to make sure it's within the statutory deadline. A note gets sent to the requester saying, okay, it looks like you meet the parameters of a request. We're going to work on the opinion. And then for open record and open meeting opinions, we're required by law to take the facts given by the public entity. So when we get that email request from a citizen, they're alleging a meeting violation. We send it to city council, usually CC the attorney, and say, here's the request for the opinion. Here's some questions that we need answered. Do you agree that the notice was incorrect? And we kind of go back and forth on those questions. And when we get the city's response, we start drafting the opinion. And if there is a written opinion that concludes that a violation occurred, the entity has 7 days to correct a violation. So a pretty common one right now is improperly noticed meetings. You have the wrong date, or you failed to include an executive session, but you did everything else right. Our remedy with that, and it's very clear, all of these opinions are on our website, but if we find a violation, it'll say like steps needed to remedy violation. And for a meeting notice violation, it'll likely be post the notice. Correct it, post it. If you failed to provide minutes, it'll be provide the minutes. Those types of things. If the city would not do that within 7 days, the requester could pursue a civil lawsuit. And the statute has different things that can be awarded, such as attorney's fees or costs. My office can also mandate training for violations of the law. To my knowledge, that's never happened, but that statute was changed a couple years ago. Again, violations might be subject to a lawsuit. There's deadlines of when the requester would need to initiate that lawsuit. The court can award damages, those types of things. And then just a few criminal penalties. I say my office, but I guess it's specific to my boss that the Attorney General can refer a public servant to the state's attorney if there's multiple violations of open record or meeting laws, kind of any violations in 4404. And anybody who violates the law, any part of 4404, meeting or records, could be guilty of a Class A misdemeanor. So another quick legislative update. I think there's going to be 2 bills here that are effective next week. The first one is publication of legal notices. It was House Bill 1197, recognizes newspapers have e-editions. And now e-editions and publish can be the same as the e-print. This was a pretty big change. For a long time, publishing in the newspaper meant the paper notices had to go out, so now that's just been updated. And this one you might come into contact a little bit more. We've had protection for images of body cameras for law enforcement and firefighters for the last couple of years. But now it's going to be even broader to who can do it. It's not going to be tied to body cameras of law enforcement and fire. It's going to be all public employees. So if you have a city inspector, any other public employee that's wearing a body camera, the images that are taken in a private place hasn't changed, that is still exempt. So the only thing that changed is who is wearing the camera, but the image is still in a private place, it's still exempt. If it's in a public place, it's still open. The 2 kind of big changes to remember are going to be those executive sessions. There's a change on attorney consultation, and that you need to post your notices on your website moving forward. Okay. So this is my resources slide, and everything that I talked about should be included in all of these resources. On our website, the manuals and guides, we kind of have our 1-pagers for open records and open meetings. That's kind of a general, covers most of what I talked about today. The template that I referred to, that's available there. And then the sample meeting notice checklist, and the open meetings guide, all 3 of those were updated yesterday on the website for the changes for the notice requirements. Record changes will be coming soon, but the meeting ones are good to go. Any final questions? Yes. So this is an interesting question, because as I've been updating my meeting forms in the last couple of days, we do talk about emergency meetings. And I'm like, what would an emergency meeting be? So I really appreciate that example. But my take on that is going to be the law doesn't really recognize emergency meetings, and we don't really have emergency exemptions. There was the exception, but I would take a look at that one to see if you fall under like the emergency disaster relief, and that sends you to another part of Century Code. But my take is that it's really specific. Like you kind of need like flood disaster type situations. So otherwise, my take would be it's just going to be a special meeting, and you need to do your best to comply. The thing with noticing meetings is that you need to be in substantial compliance. And so in a situation, everybody's snowed in at home. My suggestion is meet as many of the notice requirements as you can, like posting on your website. You can do that from home. Hopefully somebody can. Are you going to be able to get it at the main office? No, but you can get all of the other requirements. And it's kind of the best you can do. And if somebody asks for an opinion on it, we would look at all the factors that you likely substantially complied. So this question is about people who are banned from the library and if they still have the right to attend the open meeting that's held at the library. I really want to defer to the city attorneys on this. Yeah, I agree with Steph on that. Thanks. From my take, they certainly always have the right to be at an open meeting. You can also take into consideration safety concerns and kind of any way that you can address the safety concerns that's not banning them from the open meeting would be my suggestion. Yep. Yes. Yeah, so this question is about meeting minutes. I'll just answer generally. Any meeting, a committee, city council, any meeting minutes, when they're requested, they're provided in the form they are when they're requested. But there's certainly no requirement that they have to be approved before you provide them. It would just be like handwritten notes. You can certainly, I mean, I've had that question of my clients and we provide them, but I put in the email very clearly, these are draft minutes. They have not been approved, subject to change. So you don't have that person coming back saying, well, the vote was different on the copy you gave me. I was like, yep, that was a mistake. Sorry, we caught it when it was approved. But if it's asked, you provide it. Yes. Okay, so this question is about e-publishing. And if you have the option to use e-publishing, is that going to satisfy the notice requirement versus print? Because it's more cost effective to do e-publishing. I think that's going to be a little bit case by case basis. My understanding of the law change more applied to the newspaper side than it did the entity side. So it's just kind of recognizing that newspaper notice means paper or print. So yes, I think it's going to comply, but it also depends on kind of what you're noticing and if there's any other specific things. But that change was to the publication requirements for notices, like in the newspaper type section. And so it kind of attaches to them like a newspaper decision on where to print it. And I think that's where it's going to get handled more than it will like the city side. I skim this part. And I usually get called out on it. Okay, so this question is there any requirement in state law that if you have the ability to stream your meetings and you are streaming the meetings, that all meetings have to be streamed? No, there's no requirement. The requirement in law is if they're streamed, the public can access the streaming. But And for a variety of reasons, it could be technology, it could be whatever reason, that this one isn't streamed. But it is being held here. All of the other notice requirements are followed. Still going to be a valid meeting. Yes. Yeah, there's no statutory requirement to broadcast, and that's left up to the entity. There's no requirement to record kind of your standard meetings or your special meetings, your committee meetings, no requirement to record outside of executive sessions. The only recording that's required is executive session. Yep, you're welcome. Yes. No requirement in the law for broadcasting or streaming, or no requirement in the law for technology. And I have heard of different entities interpreting that different ways. And for now, you get to interpret it. So I would just kind of defer to the department, the council, city attorney, and kind of making those decisions. Any other record or meeting questions?
Just on the fee issue, you're allowed to charge 25 cents a page for printing out a written document. But if it's available electronically, it's free, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so this question is, you can charge for printing off a copy of a record, but if it's available electronically, and is that free? That was your question. So my follow-up is it just available electronically, like an email that you could forward, or is it something that's available on your website? So if it's an email that they've requested, the request is by email, they're fine with an electronic copy, and you just forward one single email, it took you under an hour to do that, that's gonna be free.
If somebody wanted a letter, for instance, most of my letters, I mean, it might be printed out or whatever, but more than not, it's not on our website so much as it's in our electronic files.
Yeah.
And in order for me to make a printed copy of it, I would have an electronic version printed and then make it available in whatever way, mail or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But generally, I could just forward it, it's a Word file or something like that, and just forward it to the person electronically.
Yep, generally that sounds free to me.
Thank you.
Is that as long as the time factor?
Yes.
Come in? So if you had to assemble hundreds of documents and it took 4 hours, you could charge the time.
Yeah, you could charge for your 3 hours, yeah. But if you're just forwarding, even if you kind of take that second step of like it's a Word document, you should probably provide the Word document or a PDF, whatever it is, that's gonna be free. The only thing you can charge, the only record you can charge for is if it is printed in paper or mailed or kind of everything else on the list, but
As you know, increasingly, we're just doing electronic files.
Yes.
now anyways.
yeah. And I don't know if the law will change. Someday the law is going to change, but we are kind of getting more questions about that, more time, and we're not even seeing it kind of on the employee level. We're seeing it on like the outside IT company level. So I think there might be changes in the future to kind of how that works, because we're not printing paper letters anymore.
We modify these documents to law. Instead of sending maybe a Word document that they could then edit, reprint, and send it here, can you modify that document, let's say a Word document, to a PDF that would be locked?
Can you modify documents to lock them in response to record requests? Yeah, yep, but to lock. For the most part, I leave that up to the entity to decide, maybe division-wise, maybe with your city attorney. From open meeting laws, you provide the record that you have. You don't have to create a new one. But I think there's some things to balance. What is in the record? I wouldn't alter it too much, but it's a good question.
I don't have an issue with sending like Word documents. It's not uncommon that I'll get requests for copies of documents just so that somebody can copy paste and make it their own.
Mm-hmm.
So, and you always have your copy of your document. So if like the concern is that you're gonna send it to them and they're gonna switch all the numbers out and say like, Yahoo, I'm a little bit, or like that, you still have your copies of the documents. You still have the official copies of the document. And so that should alleviate that concern. But I don't have concerns with sending like a Word document form or something like that if somebody wants. We'll often send them to other cities, for example. If they just like, we like how you did X, Y, and Z, can you send us a copy of it? We just send over the Word document and they switch out line on for window or whatever.
Michaela.
And just since we're talking about this, a quick question, since it's getting recorded, a good thing to clarify. So when IT pulls like an archive email, it comes in HTML form. In order for us to redact, we normally have to put it in PDF form. You cannot charge for the time that it takes you to create that into a PDF, because technically it's your fault. Well, not your fault, but it's your software's issue that you can't redact in the form that it comes to you in, right?
Sure. So repeating this for everybody online, this question is what you can charge for with relation to redaction and like emails. And if you are going to your IT department and you're asking for a file that has a lot of those emails, a lot of companies it is coming in HTML or some other file format, and we have to do the same thing, put it in a PDF and redact it. Can you charge for that time or not? No, you're limited to charging for kind of the redacting of the confidential information. So once you get that PDF, then your clock can start. But we also used to get questions of like, if you have the papers, can you charge to scan it in? That time doesn't count either. So you can only charge for the redacting and the locating. Yes.
I will just say it. I did this a lot at the federal level at like big scale stuff, and we run into issues with metadata in the original copies, which is like hidden information inside of there. And so we actually do recommend people convert stuff to PDF unless the requester really wants the native version. Especially like with Excel files, it can get really tricky too to know like what's underneath the formulas and things like that. So I just say be careful with the metadata.
So I want to go back to the straw polling question that you had, and I've only been an elected official since November, but I spent a lot of years as a concerned citizen before that. And the issue of, so if I want to meet with, or if any citizen wants to meet with all members of the city council to talk about how we need a new ice cream shop in Minot, how do we do that without making it straw polling? Is there advice for like me now as an elected official on how to respond to that, other than saying I can't meet with you because I don't want to do straw polling?
I can't meet with you sounds good to me. But you can certainly talk to Steph on if there's some type of, like the commission or the council has any type of guidance on that, especially for new council members. But generally, there's not going to be a way to do it. It's going to be come to the meeting. Call the city clerk's office or whoever creates the agenda and ask for the ice cream shop to be added to the agenda. Or if you have like a public comment period, come to the public comment period, tell all of us at the meeting. But most other interactions are going to be a straw polling issue.
It seems that the limitation is on us doing the polling, not on the citizen. I would argue that it's a perversion to not allow the citizen to ask us, and it's an abrogation of our responsibilities to share our positions if we're asked. I mean, this is going to be related to something I was going to bring up too. It's very similar. Is we have people writing the whole council saying, you know, I think such and such, and you know, I think they wrote an answer, and our current verbiage says 4 of us can't respond. I mean, that seems like that fundamentally goes against our role of being transparent and responsive. We can't say yes. I agree with you. I agree it's an issue if we share it with each other, but if we respond to the constituent, if their initiative, it's their initiative to ask us, I just don't see how the open records law would apply to them in a sense.
Well, I think the open records law definitely does, but the open meetings is going to be, that discussion should be in an open meeting.
But it's not a discussion they're asking us. We're not discussing among ourselves. And we
if
wouldn't
it
even
stays
know what
limited to
people
that.
said.
That's where we start getting
Right.
into kind of going down the rabbit hole again.
Right. Well, to show you how I see the other side of it, I've been approached by reporters occasionally for a story. They said, what do you think of this? And as part of the question, they said, well, Alderman so-and-so said this, Alderman so-and-so said that. And I stopped them, I interrupted them, I said, I don't want to hear, I don't want to
Right.
know. So, you know, I see the openness very, very strongly,
Mhm.
but I think it fundamentally inhibits the citizens' rights to ask us and our responsibility to respond to them. You know, and I don't know if there's only one other Alderman responding to the question or five
Right.
responding. How can I tell?
Yes, those are concerns.
And in my response, if a citizen were to call me and say, I would like the phone numbers of all the council, I tell them where it's available.
Right.
But my second response to that is, if you would like to bring anything up to the council as a whole, our personal appearances are one of the items on the agenda. Please come address them publicly. And I do that just because I don't try to put anyone in a situation where a violation can happen, because it could be perceived that way.
But I see that as very problematic in threatening people's safety. If so-and-so is concerned, for example, about rights of some minority group, and they're forced to come out and say, look, I'm concerned about this in a public meeting, they're going to get blowback. So I can see being careful about it, but to prohibit us from responding to concerns and questions, I think is problematic. If nothing else, it's a violation of my First Amendment rights to speak. If I can't speak to someone.
I'm not nodding yes to that.
Right. I'm just expressing my feelings.
Sure, and I appreciate those concerns definitely, and right now, the law is what it is.
And so what would your opinion be on?
Nope.
We would defer to our council.
Yes.
You can talk through that too. You can always accept information. Like, the concern is, are you building a consensus on an issue outside of the public meeting? Like, that's the
That's
big
clearly wrong. That's
picture.
clearly wrong.
Exactly. So if you have reporters that are coming up to you, they may just not be as well versed. They may be new. They may not understand the position that they're putting you in. So that's where I would say the onus would be on the council member or the member of the board to tell them, I appreciate your questions. Like, we're going to discuss this at the next meeting. Here's the date and time. You're welcome to come and ask those questions then. And then once a decision was made, you can make comment on, I voted for this, I voted against this, I think it was a good decision or not. Not satisfying.
I think, again, a citizen has the right to ask us, and I don't think we can be constrained, or should be constrained in terms of what we tell them individually. If we collude with each other, if we call each other, if we come up with if we poll each other on what each other thinks, or we come up with a joint answer, clearly it has to be done publicly. But if someone asks us individually, what do you think about an issue? I think we have to have the right to respond, and they have to have the right to ask us.
Well, you have to remember too, your response is your response at a given point in time. In
Right.
between here and there, you could learn information
Right, of
that could
course.
cause you to change your
Right,
mind on
right.
it too. So that's part of the importance of meetings or the discussions. You can always gather information, but the actual discussion of the issues is always must have, I think, in the dais. I think it protects the council, and I think it protects the citizenry too, and the transparency of the whole
Right,
process.
but again, it's not a discussion if it's between the citizen and me. It's a discussion if it's between me and someone else on the council, and that is problematic, I agree. But I don't see this being a discussion if it's someone asking me and responding. That's not a discussion that's not a discussion between the forum.
I think the challenge of that though is, and I think this is why I kind of agree with the state attorney general on this is, so let's say we have a developer that wants to come and do a project, right? And they're going to come and talk to each of the council individually to make sure that they have support on a majority of the council. Council's not talking with each other, but that developer is making sure that they have all the votes they need on the council to make that decision. I think that's inappropriate. And so the question is if you have a citizen coming and talking to you about a pothole on the street, that may be a little bit different, maybe less risk and probability versus a multi-million-dollar tax incentive for a developer on a project. The question is there's a lot of gray area in there, and the state law defines clearly that once a majority of the council is participating in that conversation, if it's a public conversation, it needs to happen in an open meeting. So my advice to the council has been and always will be, if you have the media or you have a citizen come and they start saying, I've talked to so-and-so, so-and-so, and so-and-so, I would hold the brakes on that and say, I'd be happy to put this on a public agenda for you so that we as a council as a whole can talk about that. But it appears to me you talked to several council members and I don't want to put us in a position of violating open meeting law. So the best step is let's talk about this in an open.
And my response would be that substantively, if you want the city's opinion, you need to talk about it publicly. You get the permission or get non-permission for your development. I also would cite the Menendez case in New Jersey, where this is normal politics. I mean, people go to us and ask us, what do you think? You know, Menendez, the Supreme Court threw out his conviction for fraud, whatever it was, campaign things, because he promised something to a constituent. Well, that's what constituents do. That's what politics is. They come to us and ask for things, and they get things back, and we get things in return. So, I mean, in a way that goes against the fundamental kind of process of how it works. But, you know, I very much agree we can't conspire, we can't talk with each other, but I think there's a difference between us talking with each other and us talking with the constituent.
But again, my main point is that you're going to have some entities within the public.
Right.
They're going to try to use that argument to circumvent the system and make sure that they have the decision lined up where they want it to be before it's actually talked about fully in the public. Whether it's an ordinance change, it's a development project, any of those types of things, North Dakota state law defaults to all that has to happen simply with the quorum of the council publicly, and serial meetings with individual council members can qualify as an open meeting.
Yeah, I think the suggestions from city staff are great. That's definitely how our office looks at it. I do know that can be difficult from the political side, and the problem of your example with just like one person asking you the opinion on a pothole, you don't know who else they're asking, and that's where it can kind of be the larger problem for staff, because they do know, or that one person does know, and then they're presenting it as a foregone conclusion as a developer. So when those things come up, I mean, everybody's kind of doing the best they can, defer to staff. It sounds like you guys we're all on the same page, so.
But
Another question?
Would a possible solution be like, just share all of the topics that you've received from people that, on the agenda for your next meeting? Like, I received these following inquiries, everybody can share what they got, and then and then you can talk about it there. Or you can tell your constituent, I will put that on the list of topics to discuss at the next, or to raise or offer at the next meeting.
Yeah, I think those were kind of the suggestions that I had, and then Steph and Harold too, of where kind of going to city staff and saying, you get a response to the constituent, let's talk about the ice cream shop at the next meeting, this is who you contact to get on the agenda. And Michaela's response of, when somebody calls her, okay, let's put this on the agenda. That's just kind of how we handle it for now. Any other questions? Yes.
So, kind of in the same thing that we're talking about, like, so if somebody feels that their safety is near, would it be okay to talk about that in executive session with council, to like their opinion to the council?
Okay, so the question is about if like a constituent would think their safety would be at risk talking about an agenda item to city council. I don't see how that fits under any current executive session issues. There might be other ways to address that. I think you could work again with city clerk, city attorney's office to kind of address those concerns. Okay. I think that's all from me.
Thank you so much, Ms. Lockhart. So, and thank you everybody for attending. There should be a recording of this available on YouTube as well as the city's Facebook page, and then we'll also have it archived in our Teams links too. So if anybody wants to revisit any of the questions that were discussed today or look at the PowerPoint, we'll try to send that out. Did you have a question?
I know PD Records would like a copy of the PowerPoint. I'll have her.
So with the piece.
I'll have her email it to me, and
Okay.
it'll be on the website under the agenda probably by this afternoon.
Okay.
So if you look up the agenda for this meeting, it should say discussion of open records, and right underneath it will be the
Okay.
Okay, and for those online, a request was made to have the PowerPoint presentation available, and we'll have that made available underneath the Agenda Center on the City of Minot website. With that, thank you so much for attending, and feel free to give me a call if anybody has any questions.